Good morning, dear participants of the Engadinarttalks, which this year are taking place, as you know, under the heading of Silent Listen. Let me start by saying something about the idea behind this title. Although it couldn't really be clearer, ultimately, if you will, it also conceals this blunt request: silence, please. Now we curators always sit down together during the Engadinarttalks weekend here in Suat in order to discuss possible topics for the following year in general, highly associative brainstorming session. This doesn't mean to say that we always come to a decision right away and that the hot topic instantly leaps out at us, striking all of us equally as relevant, potent, and broad-reaching. But last year, it seemed we immediately began talking enthusiastically about the theme of silence, which received strong support. And that's where this object came into this object also came in, a musical box that Christian Marclay released as an edition in 2005. Silent, listen, two words formed with the same 6 letters and which are therefore anagrams of one another. As soon as you open the lid, the movement begins to turn and play its tinkling notes, and we listen. Because you are all silent, you can hear it. In a brilliantly concise way, this little object communicates a profound wisdom that silence and listening are interlinked and that one is dependent upon the other. Marclay's musical box also conceals a reference to art history, if not needed to human history, and certainly to John Cage, a great artist, innovator of music, and invoker of silence. Cage's work, 4 minutes, 33 seconds, became, in its nothingness, a kind of immaterial monument of the 20th century art history. The piece, which was composed in 1952, also has another title, Taket, meaning is silent, after a common musical term. Taket is not a rest lasting for a specific number of beats, but a conscious sitting out, for example, in an orchestral piece of music, when Taket tells an instrumentalist to remain silent until the end of a movement while the others play on. In performances of John Cage's composition, however, a pianist sits down in front of a grand piano, immediately closes the lid and looks at a stopwatch. The piece then lasts for precisely 4 minutes and 33 seconds, during which the audience is confronted with the silence that fills the concert hall, or rather with the ambient sounds and noises this silence contains. A challenge that made history. John Cage subsequently became, not just through this work, of course, a great pioneer and inspirer of post-war modernism. Music was the starting point for an oeuvre that developed in close association with other arts and avant-garde movements of the time, with that crossover energy which strove to fuse art and life in dance, painting, and theater too. Cage's work represented the breaking out of old, long-established conventions, of rigid, traditional patterns, and of thinking in narrow terms of isolated genres. But that is not all, for the aim of all this was to expand and refine our perception, This is where the listen of the musical box comes into play. The goal was to heighten our awareness of even the tiniest individual elements that lie undetected along the wayside, as it were, to sharpen our senses and ultimately to open up unknown universes in our most immediate, most familiar surroundings. The creator of this musical box, Christian Marclay, was born in 1955 and stands here for the following generation of artists. As a visual artist, right from the start of his career, Marclay has made art which is always connected in some way with sound and music. What John Cage, Merce Cunningham, Robert Rauschenberg, Yvonne Reiner, and Trisha Brown, but also the Fluxus movement had introduced as radical innovations, Marclay took as his starting point and then translated into postmodernism. We might mention in this context other artists such as the great theater innovator Robert Wilson, who dismantled the hierarchy in the production of so-called spoken word theater. Wilson structurally accessed all the processes on stage: lighting, gestures, space, sound, the time factor, language, even psychology, in order to remix all these elements and let them fuse into a single, densely radiant texture. In 1979, artist Max Neuhaus proposed a silent alarm clock, or rather a clock that awakens one with silence. Instead of a bell, which begins with a sudden clang and gradually dies away, this concept is precisely the opposite. The sound is introduced gradually. Beginning inaudibly, it grows slowly over a period of minutes and, at its height, suddenly disappears. The long, subtle emergence of the sound causes it to go unnoticed. It becomes apparent only at the instant of its disappearance, creating a sense of silence. Maria Nordmann, another artist of this generation, has likewise experimented with the deprivation of all sound, the anechoic chamber in art. Here, silence is defined and experienced in its most extreme form, which can be highly unsettling. Silence as deprivation, indeed the ultimate deprivation, is today perhaps the antithesis of our permanent sense of having too much of everything. Too much information, too many images, impressions, sounds, goods. You will understand, I am sure, why I have launched straight into a discussion of art. After all, this entire weekend is taking place in the name of Engadin Art Talks. And art stands in the middle of our name as a kind of fulcrum. But Engadin Art Talks has always veered off into other eras and disciplines as well. And very importantly, that does not exclude the burning issues of our time. As Engadin Art Talks celebrates its 10th anniversary, this is the moment to look back at the historical predecessor with the same initials, but with whom we are not directly connected. E.A.T stands in this case for Experiments in Art and Technology, an association created in 1966 as a non-profit foundation established to promote collaboration between artists and engineers. Many of the artists I have already mentioned were involved in this E.A.T, which was mainly active in the early 1970s. The aim was to bring together representatives of different disciplines, and in particular the sciences, in order to generate exchange and make scientific and technological expertise accessible to artists. This then flowed into their creative projects in spheres ranging from the kinetic sculptures by Rauschenberg and Tinguely and the acoustic experiments of John Cage and David Tudor to the choreographies of the Judson Dance Theatre. The project was only short-lived, however, as it was conceded that the two professions, the worlds of engineering and the world of art, were too different to come any closer together. During this period, too, technology and faith into technology rapidly became associated with the war industry and the Vietnam War, rendering them shady and distasteful. If an intellectual connection nevertheless exists between the experiments in art and technology and our own E.A.T, the Engadinarttalks, then it lies in our multidisciplinary nature, and yes, why not, in our future-oriented perspective. After 10 years, we can look back on a successful experiment. We too are veering off and reaching out a hand, so to speak, to the other disciplines, as we have done from the start, but our reasons are not utilitarian. We know that we have the advantage of coming together here without being confined within a specific academic or museum framework. No, what is on the wind here, symbolically and in reality, is the openness of the alpine world. And it's symbolic too that we always have a particularly large number of architects among us. Architects get physically to grips with the real world and at the same time must plan far into the future. We like them for their multi-perspective thinking, and so we are especially pleased that this year too we have many architects among our speakers. Indeed, our program once again brings together a rich and exciting mix of protagonists. Scanning the list, it features artists, designers, a philosopher, biologist, a neuroscientist, a poet who performs with a dancer choreographer, a composer, an adventurer and author, a video and sound artist, and many more besides. Up here in the mountains, we are withdrawn in a good way. We are certainly not a sect, but again and again we return to art as a refuge. Here the theme of silence takes on a different hue, a different taste than in the town, in the city, in the valley below. To come back to the burning issues of our day, I would like to offer the following final thoughts. Among the associations triggered by our silent listen theme is the sense of danger, and in particular, the idea of the silently approaching threat. Once again, I want to draw our attention to a work of art. It is by Lawrence Weiner. It was located in Vienna, and it is probably one of the most impressive and important art memorials in the public space, smashed to pieces in the still of the night. The German translation, which was on the other side of the tower, zerschmettert in Stücke, im Frieden der Nacht, is interesting because where the English says still, it uses the word Frieden, peace. The inscription is on a Second World War flag tower, one of 6 built in Vienna by the Nazi between 1942 and 1945. Wiener's work invokes the eeriness of stillness and the danger that spreads silently and unnoticed, or as it says here, which smashes pieces to pieces. Piece to pieces, sorry. Sadly, the work does not exist anymore. It was destroyed last year after having been up for almost 30 years. In the English word silent, there is also a suggestion of silenced, a silencing in the direction of extinction. The word of extinction in German is aussterben, which represents anonymous amplification of the word sterben, to die, and carries the sense of eradication. Yes, you know what I'm referring to, climate change and the extinction of animal and plant diversity. Meanwhile, I read in the last Sunday's newspaper that 600 million cameras equipped with facial recognition technology are being installed in China. Due to a bonus-malus point system, 20 million people have already been penalized and are no longer allowed to travel by train or plane. To say that danger spreads silently is a truism, which leads me to my first conclusion. The theme of silent listen is by no means comfortable as it may seem at first sight.